Before you start Lesson 7, make sure you do Test B in the Test Masters on solving equations. In Lesson 7, what we'll be covering is lines and angles. And lines and angles are a very basic thing to know about in the study of geometry. Geometry is basically a branch of math that deals with measuring different things. Geo means earth, metry means measure, so to measure the earth or measure things on the earth. And more specifically, to measure their length or their area or their volume. We'll be doing all of those things in this book. Let's just begin with the very fundamentals, and the very, very basic thing is a point. And I just put a little dot there on the screen. Now something that's kind of weird to think about is that point that I've drawn, that represents the location of a point. I can't really identify the exact point. A point is really an imaginary thing. For example, if I had a magnifying lens and put it over that point, it would magnify that point. But now, where is the location that I was trying to identify? Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? Which one is really the true point? We represent the location of a point by drawing a little dot on our paper. But it's really an imaginary thing. Likewise, a line is also imaginary, but we represent a line by, well, what you know of as a line on a paper. And we put arrows on the end to represent that that line continues on forever and ever in both directions. Now think about a point. A point is just one location. So doesn't it make sense that a line is just a bunch of points all connected together? Now, of course, you're never going to draw a line by just doing that, drawing a bunch of tiny points all one after another to make your line. You're just going to draw it continuously. But if you want to think about it the way mathematicians think about it, a line is just a series of points, one after another, and we represent that by drawing a line on our paper. We represent the location of that line. A point and a line, those are really just imaginary things, but we can represent their locations. And we can also name them. We can put a point and draw another point, and let's just call that point C and that point D right there. And we can give that line a name. We'll call it line CD. Now, the order that you put those letters in is not that important. You can also say or line DC. We could also represent it with a symbol. We could just say CD with a little line drawn above CD. You could do the same thing with DC as well, just like that. Something important to keep in mind: in order to give a name to a line, you have to represent it by at least 2 points. That's how you define a line. I mean, just think about it. If you just had 1 point, you could draw a whole bunch of different lines through that 1 point. But if you represent it with 2 points, there's only one line that can make it through both of those points. So you have to define a line using at least 2 points. You can use more than 2, but you have to have a minimum of 2 to define a line and to name a line. Now, another 2 components of a line are a ray and a line segment. A ray is basically just half a line. So we start it and just put an arrow in one direction, and we have to have 2 points to name it. So let's call that C and that D there, and that's a ray. It's basically, best way to think about that is like half of a line. It only goes on in one direction, either to the right or to the left. And we can identify it like that with just an arrow going in one direction above it. Now you can't name this ray like that. You can't do that because you always have to start with that endpoint. You have to start, like for this example, you have to say CD because C is that endpoint or starting point. and you write the letter that represents that starting point first. So ray is basically half of a line, and then a line segment, that's just a section of a line that has endpoints on both ends. So like if you look at line CD, we could talk about segment CD. We could just say CD with a line without any arrows above it, and we know that we'd be talking about segment CD. You could also say segment DC, mainly because both ends are the same. On line segments you have endpoints at both ends. On lines you have arrows at both ends, so it doesn't matter the order that you write the letters in. It does matter on array though, because one end has an endpoint, the other end goes on forever. So it's not really an end, it just continues. Let's think of a couple of other things about lines. If you had a pair of lines, they can either intersect, those would be called intersecting lines there, or they don't intersect. And just say that those two don't intersect. Now, lines that don't intersect, they have a special name. Those are called parallel lines. Anytime you're working with two lines, they're either going to do one or the other, because remember, they go on forever in both directions. So eventually, they're either going to intersect, or if they're parallel, they will never ever intersect. A special type of intersecting line is when you have one straight up and down and the other one horizontal. Those are called perpendicular lines. You can identify a perpendicular pair of lines by a little box or square at one of the corners. If you can draw a square at the corner, then those are perpendicular lines. Or if you see a pair of lines like that with a box at the intersection, that's telling you that those two lines are perpendicular. You'll see that a lot in your books. When you see a little box at the corner like that, that's telling you those two lines are perpendicular to each other. So when you're working with a pair of lines, they're either going to intersect or they don't intersect. If they don't intersect, we call those parallel lines. We don't just say that they don't intersect. We have a special name for those. And intersecting lines that intersect at, we call it right angles to each other, or one's vertical, one's horizontal. Those we call perpendicular lines. When you see this square at the intersection of them, that is identifying those lines as perpendicular. Now let's talk about angles. Keep in mind that you're supposed to be taking notes on everything that I write on the board. You should have like a notebook that you're taking notes in and working all the practice problems, and then maybe a separate notebook that you're working out your homework in. Angles, best way to think about those are two rays that have a common endpoint. Let's just draw an angle and put arrows on the end to show that that goes on forever in both of those directions. The top ray, we'll call that one A. Put an A there and a B there, and then we'll put a C here. So basically, that angle was formed by ray BA and then ray BC, and they have that common endpoint B. Now we use a special symbol to identify an angle, and it's just an angle looking symbol, and then we write the letters ABC, or we could do this angle CBA. Where the two rays meet, where that endpoint is in common, we call that the vertex. Has a special name. And notice when we write down the angle, like angle ABC or CBA, the vertex, that letter representing the vertex, is always in the middle. It's the middle of those three letters. So you have to have three letters to define or identify an angle. Or in other words, 3 points. The middle one is always the end point of the two rays, which when we combine them like that, we call that intersection point. We call that the vertex. Lines have to be defined with 2 points. Rays or angles have to be defined with 3 points, and the vertex is always the middle point. Now let's talk about 4 different kinds of angles. And when we're talking about angles and naming different angles, we always do them relative to a right angle. And a right angle is like this. Notice that square corner that I put at the vertex. Remember what that square corner means? That means that those two rays are perpendicular to each other. That's how you define a right angle, is the rays are perpendicular to each other. So that's a right angle. Now if you have an angle that's shorter than that or skinnier than that, basically, draw the bottom one the same, and like that you can tell that that angle is going to be smaller. In other words, when I'm saying what I mean when I say smaller is this distance from here to here is less than that distance right there. We call those acute angles when they're less than a right angle. We call them obtuse angles when they're greater than a right angle, like that one that I just drew. So we say that's an obtuse angle. Now, if you went all the way around back the other way, you'd have a straight angle, which is a line. Remember your definition of an angle, 2 rays with a common endpoint. So they can have that endpoint right there in common. Doesn't matter where they're drawn. That's a straight angle, though. It's basically 2 right angles. Now let's go ahead and do some practice problems dealing with lines and angles. Practice problem A says name a point on the line that is not on ray QS. Now remember, when we're defining lines or line segments or rays, we have to have at least 2 points. They don't have to be one after another. They just have to be on that line or ray to define them. So we have a line here, PQRS, and then the line that goes through all of those points. Ray QS, that would just be from here over to the end. That's what we're talking about. That's the part of that line that we're talking about. So a point on that line that is not on ray QS would be point P, right? It's to the left. R is included on ray QS. So point P is the one that we're trying to figure out. So just keep that in mind when you're talking about a line. It can have 600 different letters labeled as points on that line. You just have to have 2 to define it, and that's all you need to tell what ray you might be talking about that's part of that line, or what line segment you're talking about that's part of that line. Look at practice problem B. I'm still using the line above practice problem B here, and there's some information that's been given there. Line segment PQ, we can tell we're talking about line segment because I just have the little segment drawn above PQ. It doesn't have arrows on the end. So segment PQ is 8 centimeters long. Segment QR is 12 centimeters long. Find the length of segment PR. So that means basically, what's the distance from there to there? That's what I want to know. Try not to make that problem more difficult than it needs to be. Wouldn't you just add PQ to QR? So you'd have 8 plus 12 equals 20. Now in geometry, anytime you're doing something in geometry, like here we're measuring a length, later on you'll be measuring areas and volumes, you have to write down the units that are being used. Don't just write 20 down, you need to say 20 centimeters. That's the length of segment PR. In practice problem C, I want you to draw two parallel and two perpendicular lines. So just pause the CD and draw those, and just want to make sure you know the difference between those, what those mean. So two parallel lines would just be like this, and just showing that they're not going to intersect. Two perpendicular, remember those are at right angles to each other, or in other words, one horizontal, one vertical. Now, to get that answer right, you needed to put a little box at one of the corners. It doesn't matter which one, but that designates that those are perpendicular. That's how you designate perpendicular lines. Now, in D through H, in D, E, and F, I want you to tell me what kind of angles those are. G and H, I want you just to name those two angles. So in D, that would be a right angle, and we'll just write down R for right angle. E, that would be straight. F, that would be acute. It's less than a right angle, less than a 90-degree angle. Sometimes right angles are also called 90-degree angles. In G and H, remember there's two ways to write an angle. Put the little angle symbol, X, Y, Z, or angle Z, Y, X. Vertex always has to go in the middle. And then on H, angle H, A, Z, and then also angle Z, A, H. Vertex is always written as the middle letter when you're identifying an angle like that. Okay, well that's all for lesson